Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Maryland Libraries Together. My name is Nicholas Brown, and I am the Chief Operating Officer for Communication and Outreach at the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, which is one of 24 public library jurisdictions in Maryland. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Maryland Libraries Together series, which is a statewide virtual programming initiative cooperatively organized through Maryland State Library and supported in part by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Before we get started, I would like to recognize our ASL interpreter, Richard, who is helping us out tonight. So thank you, Richard. If you would like to access the live captions for the event, we invite you to view the Facebook feed, and I'll put the link in the chat for that in just a couple moments. Tonight's event is very special because it's part of two initiatives. One is Maryland Libraries Together, which is a project that we started as a statewide community in 2020 to bring our libraries together with the community into spaces where we could tackle some of the pressing issues of our time related to social justice and racial equity. Since then, we've developed a new project called Guide to Indigenous Maryland. And in this project, we are developing an app and a website that are going to be used to teach the general public about some of the really important and significant Indigenous and Native American heritage found throughout our state here in Maryland. That project is being curated by Dr. Elizabeth Rule, who is a professor at American University and who will be joining us tonight with our very special guest, Brandon Hobson. So before we invite our speakers on, I'm just going to give you a bit of a biographical introduction. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from National Book Award finalist Brandon Hobson, who will discuss representations of Native American and Indigenous culture in contemporary fiction through the lens of his book, The Removed, which is described as extraordinary by the Los Angeles Times. The book draws on Cherokee culture and tradition in the context of a contemporary story about family tragedy and the generational impacts of injustices. Hobson is the author of the novel Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Award for Fiction and winner of the Reading the West Book Award. His other books include Desolation of Avenues Untold and the novella Deep Ellum. His work has appeared in the Pushcart Prize anthology, The Believer, the Paris Review Daily, Conjunctions, Noon, and McSweeney's, among many other publications. He is an assistant professor of creative writing at New Mexico State University and teaches in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Hobson is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation tribe of Oklahoma. And I'm not going to do as long of a bio for Dr. Rule, but needless to say, she is a fabulous friend of Maryland Libraries. She is the originator of a project called Guide to Indigenous DC and also Guide to Indigenous Baltimore, which were early stages of a nationwide effort to make Native and Indigenous heritage much more accessible through technology for the general public. We are so grateful that she's joined our libraries in Maryland to imagine and envision a crowdsourced version of this for our state community that then she's bringing community contributions from and curating for an app that will launch later this spring. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our colleagues on here, Brandon and Dr. Rule. Last thing I want to say is please, please, please check out Brandon's books from your local public library. And if you have the means, we invite you to please consider purchasing a copy of his books from your local independent bookstore. And our partners here in Prince George's County are Mahogany Books, which is a Black family-owned independent bookstore in Prince George's County. And I'll put the direct purchasing link to their website in the chat. But without further ado, thank you everyone for joining us and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for that very kind introduction to tonight's event, and welcome, Brandon. We are so delighted to have you, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you this evening. As was mentioned during the introduction, one of the things that I'm working on and actually partnering with the Maryland Libraries on is making sure that our stories as Indigenous people are told and understood by members of the general public. As an author releasing a number of widely acclaimed books, I'm really interested in how you're engaged in this process as well. So one thing that really stood out to me right from the get-go, of course, is that the title of your book, The Removed, which we're discussing this evening, calls forth the novel's roots in the history and ongoing legacies of forced removal that Indigenous peoples from the southeastern portion of the United States faced. Many have heard of the Trail of Tears, but what would you like audiences to know in order to push past their understandings of this event? And what new elements are you able to illuminate for our public audience through this text?
Ooh, yeah, those are big questions. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, Dr. Rule, and Nick, and thanks to everybody who came out tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful, and I feel very blessed right now. So thank you. I wanted to write a novel here. The Removed not only focuses on the removal of the tribes from the southeast to Indian Territory, which is now known as Oklahoma, which is where I'm from. But I also wanted that word removal to represent and to get readers to think also about removal, both terms in terms of physical, a physical space, right? So the question of what is home is a question that I'm always thinking about. And so when our ancestors were removed, that was a question: what is home? There's a foster child in this novel named Wyatt, who is being taken in by a foster family, and so that's a question he asks: is what is home? And he being removed from his home. The family has dealt with police violence, and their son being removed from them through the police violence that was unnecessary in losing their son. So that word removed is a very important word, and it's one that I wanted to take. I wanted a lot of audience, a lot of readers to really think about in more than just one way. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. And, what you just said really resonated with me too. Even through, right, something like foster care, many folks may be unaware of, the histories around boarding schools, right, and being taken out of their native families, or even, ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which seeks to protect that. Also, urban relocation, right, is something that Indigenous communities faced, that still very much has ramifications today. And in that, line of thought, one element that I always turn to in my work in Indigenous studies is making sure that folks know that we are contemporary people, right? We are deeply connected and rooted in our past and our histories. We know those stories and it informs who we are today. But we have also survived so much and are connected in a contemporary way to our identities and to our cultural practices. And so I'm wondering, how does this work speak also to this contemporary reality that Indigenous peoples experience and live in? And, can you explain maybe a little bit about the role that intergenerationality and, relations between the generations plays in this text as well?
Yeah. Um, I guess the first part of the question is, I think the novel, what I was wanting to do is provide a very fragmented glimpse at this family. And one of the things that I want to avoid, that I think Native literature should avoid, is falling into stereotypes, right? And I think a lot of non-Native readers, to me, it feels like they only want these sort of stereotypes, the tropes of reservation life, for example, right? And there are so many Native writers out there right now writing, and I have many students who are Native, and they are going beyond that, right? And we're seeing Natives and Native writers in whole new settings, and urban Natives, and so I think avoiding the tropes is important for us as I mean, this is a novel, so it shouldn't really, people shouldn't read fiction to learn. That's what nonfiction is for, right? I mean, people should read fiction to have the experience. And so I think of myself as a fiction writer. And otherwise I would go write a nonfiction book about the history of, right? Or an academic book. I do have a doctorate from Oklahoma State. But it seems to me that a lot of people want to try to get information as if they want me to explain stuff about Native history and stuff that they should have learned in school. And that's not really my job as a fiction writer. My job is to tell a good story, and to tell a story in the best way possible, right? And I think it's really great that we are seeing a lot more Native writers write Native stories in various settings, and where they're sort of avoiding the tropes and the cliches and the stereotypes of Native life, right? So yeah, and what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
I was just kind of getting at the idea that, again, so often we see anything having to do with Native people being pigeonholed right into the past, and the reality, of course, is that we're here, right? And just like you said, we're just living our lives as people. And so I was wondering if maybe you could talk about the role that intergenerational relations plays in the text, and bringing forth some of the more historical, if we want to call them that, characters or voices into the contemporary based characters as well.
Yeah, so I have a character named Chala who is an ancestor in this book, and Chala is a shortened form of Chalagi, which is the Cherokee word for Cherokee. And Chala is based on a real man named Chali, who white people called Charlie, right? But Charlie was, the TS is pronounced ch, like CH, Charlie. So Charlie was killed by the U.S. government for refusing to leave during the removal, right? And so Chala is sort of based off him. And Chala in this novel is an ancestor spirit, and I wanted the ancestor voice of Chala to be able to talk to his son who died because they were both killed for refusing to leave the land. And so in a way that Chala faces the removal, but he sees it because he's already dead, and he's telling his son a lot of the old traditional mythology, right? The old traditional stories that arrived in Oklahoma orally, right? And that's really important, I think, to think about how stories evolved orally through an oral tradition here. And so the job of the novel, I think, with Chala is that he wanted to do these oral stories to tell them to his son. They're told in a way that includes these little, I apologize for my dogs barking, but his job was to include these little stories from traditional narratives that also have to do with removal, and so they are interludes in a sense that fit into the theme of thinking about what is home. That's an important question that I think about with a lot of my work, is what is home, and what is home here? What is home for the Cherokee? What is home for Chala after being destroyed by the by the U.S. government, what is home for the Achota family after losing their son to senseless police violence, right? And the other thing I want to mention here is that this family is based off a real Oklahoma family called the Good Blanket family, who is a Cheyenne and Arapaho family, and that they lost their son to senseless police violence in Oklahoma a few years back. And that really was the beginning of what led me to want to write this novel. And so the Good Blanket family, they are very, the resilience and is astounding. And I was just really struck by this family and wanted to write because the other thing is that the violence in this book that led to how generational trauma, to go back to the original question, to go back to the spirit and the ghosts and the intergenerational trauma that follows this book, I think is something that is very prevalent in the Native community. And the American Indian movement, that began in Minneapolis, that by Russell Means, and that American Indian movement was basically that. It was a reaction against police violence. That police violence was happening toward Native communities, and it was happening in Minneapolis. And so a lot of the tribes up there were getting together and they formed the American Indian movement. And so this has been going on forever. It's not only been going on for 200 years with the U.S. government removing tribes from the Southeast, but then it continues to happen. And so the American Indian movement was formed and due to the violence. And a few years ago, there's a lot of police violence happening against Native people. And there's a lot of murdered and missing Indigenous women, especially. And that's going on not only throughout the United States, but it's happening in First Nations in Canada. And so that is very troubling. And it's continued to be troubling for many, many years. So all that's to say is that I wanted to write a novel that sort of address some of these things in ways that I hope have not been structured or done in a novel in the past.
Right. And I definitely want us to come back to some of these topics. You already were gesturing toward some of the other questions I've been looking forward to asking you, but
sorry about that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's indicative that we're, on the same line of thinking, which is really exciting. But before we get there, maybe now would be a good time to actually share a little bit of that voice that you bring to the characters and that you bring through the text. Are you able to, provide us with an excerpt so that the audience can hear a little bit of the storytelling that you do?
Absolutely. So I'll read a little bit from. Okay, I'll read from Chala section because Chala is my favorite to write from. Just a couple of pages. That's okay. Beloved, the earth will always speak to us when we need to hear her the most. Even in my time, we were worried about rising oceans and burning land. I always looked for warnings. Our family believed strongly in Tecumseh's warning of the soldiers coming to remove us from our land. There was a drought. There were high winds and a bitter, cold winter. You are aware that this was a terrifying time for us. We were frightened, but ready to defend our home. Our people would refuse to leave, even though we were tricked by the government with their fraudulent treaty. We did not trust them. It was raining the night we rounded up a few families and quietly snuck away to hide in a cave in the mountains. I told the other people in the Cherokee language, what we do will affect our people for years to come. I thought of all my visions, our visions, the prophecy of the coming migration, and hoped they would be proven false. That night in the cave, one of the wives was so afraid for her new baby that she ran out into the rain, yelling, "Kill, kill." She felt the presence of a spirit's strength so powerfully that she threw a tomahawk into the night sky in the rain, and it never came down again. It was never found anywhere. That night it hailed large ice pellets. We were there 10 nights before they arrived to destroy our homes. We watched from afar as the ones who swarmed on our land like a pack of wolves began firing their weapons. Now there was a great threat upon us. The soldiers were ordered to be civil, but they destroyed our cabins and barns. They slaughtered our chickens and hogs and cattle. They prodded our wives and our elders with bayonets as they forced them out of their homes and to stockades. By the end, many of our people had nothing but their clothes. Everything else was gone. We felt a great misery spread throughout our land. Soldiers dug into graves to steal the gold from our dead, never bothered by the stench of corpses that filled the air. Though we were safe in seclusion, 2 other men and I couldn't stand that we were not helping our people. So we set out, armed with our weapons. And you, my brave son, you came with us. At once, the soldiers saw us approaching, and soon they surrounded us. We attacked and fought, but there were too many of them. One of them hit you with a shovel, and I lunged at him with my knife, cutting his arm. The other soldiers pulled me off and held me down. They tied us with rope. I told them to kill me first, but they did not agree. I closed my eyes and lowered my head as they pointed their rifles at us. I begged you not to open your eyes, even when they told you to. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad that we're able to put some of the text into our conversation right now and into our dialogue. I feel it really, adds a sense of, the work that you're doing as a storyteller, again, in conveying these really important messages that I'm sure are resonating with so many of your readers in different ways. And, building upon that, again, my line of work is actually focused on research on violence in Indigenous communities. And I think what we can see, from what you're discussing with, police killings in the present moment, all the way to, some of the moments of violence that you just read for us, is that for Native communities, this string of violence is really unbroken for hundreds of years. And so, right now, we are in a unique, unprecedented moment where we're focused on communities of color and police violence in particular. And so, could you speak a little bit? I know that you gestured toward this already, but do you feel that this work is particularly timely? And do you see it contributing perhaps to a larger conversation, but even maybe beyond conversation, maybe a moment of reckoning that the United States is having as a society?
I mean, I hope so. That's part of it, right? I mean, again, I'm not trying to explain things through this, but I'm trying to give, I mean, the way that art, the way that art should focus on the human condition, and that art should push boundaries and make people uncomfortable because life is uncomfortable. And here, you know, definitely these kinds of things that we're talking about here, the violence and trauma, is very uncomfortable here. And there's violence against a woman in this novel, right? That I wanted to try to pull off. I don't know that I did it very well, but I mean, I tried, and I wanted to bring the stuff to light in an art, in the way that only fiction can do artistically, for that the experience, so that through the story in which is being told, that we're reading or that we're listening to. Very happy that, you know, with the audio version of this book, and Gary Farmer was able to read, who's a kind of a hero actor of mine. He was been in Reservation Dogs, and he's a Dead Man, and in many movies, and so I was really happy. But also Delana Studi, who's Cherokee Nation, and her uncle is Wes Studi, who's very well known. But Delani was a reader, and so I mean, I wanted to bring these things in this sort of artful way, right, to be experienced. And so I hope that they're at least developing conversations with people. That's really all I want to do. I'm not an expert, you know. I'm not. You're a much better expert on this than I am. I just want to be a storyteller, and I just want to present, you know, what I know, that in an artful way, and try to do it differently than other people have done it in the past, so that, you know, we can sort of blend. Here's the historical, right, and here's the artful, but they sort of, right, combine. And what does this do for us, right? What conversations can we have right now? And with violence, and I do think that it's a really good time right now, that people are a lot more open and asking fewer questions about what Native writers they should be reading. I mean, at one time I used to get a lot of those questions, you know, where they might say, well, I've read Louise Erdrich, right? Or I've read Sherman Alexie. Who else should I be reading? And I got a whole list for you, right? That people that you should be. And there's a lot. And I know a lot of young people, natives, who want to be writers, and they're writing. And I'm there to try to mentor them and push them as much as I can, and to be the best writers they can, because they have amazing stories. And I wish that Hollywood would really, you know, get on board with this. And I'm really happy with my friend Sterling Harjo, who's also from Oklahoma, directs Reservation Dogs. And we talked about this before, a long time ago. And he was like, I don't know, man, maybe we've got a few years here where people will be. I said, I think it's going to keep going. I think people are going to continue to be interested. And so I think it's just the beginning. But we feel like it's going to end. It's not going to last very long. Like it's just a movement and it's going to go away. No. I don't. I remain more optimistic. And you know, Hollywood has a history of portraying natives as only 1800s, right, dressed a certain way and all having the same look. You know, there's a time Hollywood didn't even employ native actors. They employed Italian, and you know, so I mean, it's they've got a really, really bad history. But maybe that's starting to change. I don't know. I mean, they could try a lot harder, I think, but you know, Reservation Dogs is a great start. I know you didn't ask me about that, but I do want to mention that. Right. So
we could have a whole event on that. And I just want to point out for anyone who's unaware of some of these texts and shows that you've gestured toward, I would encourage everyone to check them out. Reservation Dogs released their first season recently. You can find it on Hulu streaming. And we have had some other author recommendations for folks interested in broadening their reading list to include more Native authors. So, I know that, like you said, that's a question we get asked often. So, wanted to draw everyone's attention to those recommendations that have already been thrown out. As you were talking too, right? I share your sentiment that maybe this is the time when we're going to have a more permanent um a seat at the table, for lack of a better way to put it, right? More representations, um, more Native voices, getting a spotlight in the mainstream. And I think it's really exciting because for far too long, as you said, forces like Hollywood and, certainly in my world, right, the policy world, Native people have been so marginalized.
Yeah.
So, with that said, I'm interested also in how you think about um, all of the violence, the trauma that you take up in your work. Um, but also like the beauty of our communities, right? At the end of the day, too, like we're survivors. We are here, and we maintain our culture, and we have revitalization efforts, and we have more, in some cases, in some tribal communities, more language speakers than we've had for a long time. And so I'm wondering too, what are your thoughts, either with respect to the text or just as, an artist yourself, how do you see things like healing, reconciliation, bringing forth the beauty of our communities into these conversations as well?
And thank you for that question. I mean, that's a question I think about. How do we heal from trauma? And that's it's a very difficult question. And so healing, and I thought about healing and resilience. Native culture is a big part of this, is resilience, right? And one of the things I wanted to focus on in this book, there's victimization in it. Yeah, I understand that. I mean, people don't have to tell me I'm, writing a lot about, and that's important for us to think about, right? That's important for non-Native readers to know, right? That we were victims. But at the same time, I do feel that there's a lot of resilience in this book. I think at the end of the book, I mean, at least I hope that was my attempt. And I tried to do that through a few different ways. But one of the ways that I focus on is through colors. And so there's this scene where one of the siblings goes into the Darkening Land, which is mentioned in the old Cherokee traditional stories as a place where souls go until justice is served, right? And the road leading out of the Darkening Land is filled with gold and green and red. So there's these, and white, these sort of cherry blossom. These three mixtures of green, gold, and red, right? The three that I really wanted to, coming out of a land that is mostly gray, black, very black and white, stepping out of black and white into color, and specifically these three green, gold, and red colors, which were a way of showing, hopefully in an artful way, resilience and coming out of racism, coming out of violence. There's a scene in this novel where the brother finds himself in the Darkening Land, fearful of losing his life by shooting, in the same way that his brother lost his life by a police shooting. He's afraid that everybody's going to shoot him in the Darkening Land. And in fact, and it's so fearful, and it's such a difficult place that they've made a video game out of it, right? and they've made a killing video game, right? That becomes Kill the Native. And so for this space, it's an alternate reality for Edgar, this character, in which he is dealing with fearing for his life that he's going to be shot in the same way that his brother was shot, right? And I wanted it to be an alternate reality, but at the same time, I wanted it to feel like, I don't know, it feels kind of like this place to me too, right? That when we're afraid of, if we're Native or I mean, any person of color or woman or whatever, that fear is so difficult, right? And so I did that. I wanted to do that as, again, in an artful way, to try to show that fear through this story of Edgar being in this alternate reality called the Darkening Land. And so, I mean, I think all these, I hope that all these issues, again, raise questions, but then we all see, I hope that we come to a point that there's a question of hope at the end, right? And resilience. Hope and resilience is what we strive for, what I strive for at the end of this book. And in terms of trauma, not only is this family going through trauma, but also the earth is going through trauma. And in the Darkening Land, we see a lot of sort of cryptic structures and you know, a lot of cryptic landscape, which is in reference, I guess, to the way that we've treated the land. So the shittier we treat the land, right, the shittier that it's going to be. I don't know what the sign is for shittier. Is that even a sign? I just have sign language. If that's really even, you know. But all joking aside, that the worse that we treat the land, right? The land, the earth handles trauma a lot like people handle trauma, and so it becomes angry, it becomes sad, and we see reactions. And so I wanted to do that a little bit with some of the Darkening Land stuff, and just throughout the novel, a lot of references to the land and the way that the land is speaking to us through the trees, through the weather, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Ooh.
I have another question for you, but I also want to encourage all of our audience members to please start thinking about some of the questions that you have for our guest, and please make sure that you submit them so that we're able to have a really robust Q&A coming up shortly. In the meantime, too, one of the things that you mentioned as well was, this being really a family-driven narrative, and I was very moved by that, as a storytelling technique, but also, when you mentioned that this was based on, a real family, right? That you're familiar with, and I was also interested too if you could maybe speak to the ways in which the removed has taken you in perhaps new or different directions than your other works. I mean, you're very accomplished and prolific, and what was new about this text for you, or the process?
Yeah, it was different, I think, than my other, because I really wanted to, these are some really, really big, heavy questions to tackle. And I wanted to attempt to at least draw light to these questions, that all of these discussions I have will lead others to begin having conversations. I don't have the answers, but I do think that they need to be these questions need to be discussed and thought about. And so I hope that I can at least lead people to curiosity. But this book was different because it was these big historical, the removal of the Trail of Tears, which a lot of people told me they didn't study in school or study much. And it was just sort of mentioned as this event that happened and then moving on, right? I mean, and not really going into the brutal sort of terror of arguably one of the worst, if not the worst event in U.S. history, right? And so between that and thinking about violence against unarmed people, violence against women. There's a sister who deals with that in this novel, and a lot of those big themes. I didn't want to provide answers, and I wanted to remain ambiguous because that's what happens with us, right? I mean, that's the way life is. Everything, is especially in our Native communities. It's things we're not getting answers, right? To why this is happening. Why so much violence against Natives? Why are Indigenous women continuing to disappear and to continue to die throughout the United States and First Nations? And why are we? I mean, we're tackling these issues in different ways, which I think is drawing more and more attention to it, and where it's not sort of swept under the rug and just, well, we're just going to leave that alone. I think that's been done for years and years, right? We're not going to talk about that, or we're going to let the tribal police take care of this, right? The police are saying this. Well, we're going to let the tribal police take care of this. We're not going to. There's a documentary, and my spouse was watching. That a young woman had talked to. I can't remember what the documentary it was, but that's what a lot of the responses she was getting from. And I'm not trying to make this an anti-police talk, of course, but it's been an issue, right? And so, how do we begin to address these things, and what can we do, right?
Powerful. I mean, these are certainly the questions that keep me up at night. And I'm sure the same is true for, many folks. So yeah, it's amazing to hear, how you're tackling them. So we have our first question from Kuros. Hello, Kuros. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. And he writes, I'm so curious what the fowl symbolized.
Yeah. So the fowl is in the novel. Thank you for this question, Kuros. And the fowl comes to is given to Edgar in a park by a friend, and the fowl begins as this kind of pretty little bird, right? This little fowl. I chose the word fowl, not bird here. It's this nice little bird, right? And then it slowly grows into becomes this cryptic thing that begins to follow him around, and it follows him all the way into the Darkening Land. And the very simple answer, Kuros, is that this is meant to symbolize his addiction following him, and that what begins here from this friend, this really nice little, what feels like this nice thing, turns into this awful addiction that he develops. and that follows him, and it never goes away. And so I just sort of made that, and I purposefully, somebody asked me, why did you use the word foul over and over? Did you do that on purpose? Yeah. And I said, of course I did that on purpose, right? I used foul throughout this, especially this one section early on. Foul is such a cryptic word. It's not pretty. It's not like, blue jay, cardinal, it's foul, right? It's such a cryptic word to me, and kind of gross. And so I wanted that repetition to sort of match with his slowly growing addiction, and that it is constantly right there until it becomes this ugly thing that follows him, and dragging its wing, or looking very haggard, and still being right there, over his shoulder, knowing there it is, right? So it's just a visual representation of his addiction to drugs, and which is a problem. I mean, in the United States, we have a terrible drug problem, right? So
yeah, even as you were talking, right, I was thinking the word foul is almost foul itself, Foul, right?
right, exactly. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a foul,
Right.
right? So yeah.
Right. Wonderful. Well, next, thank you, Christine, for writing in. She writes, "Hi, Brandon. I enjoyed your book and identified a lot of my own family's experiences as contemporary natives. As a new social worker, I'm curious, how did your background as a social worker inform your characters?"
Thank you, Christine. And I'm glad that bless you for going into social work. I did social work for 7 years, and my spouse did social work, and where we worked with, both of us worked in different areas. I mainly worked with youth. So there's a lot of youth in my books, and youth who struggle with things like addiction. And my spouse worked with more family support, helping food stamps and those kinds of things. But social work is extremely difficult, and so I think, Christine, that's amazing. That I'm always glad to meet social workers, and I'm sure you're great, because we need them, and I hope that they are valued where you're working. But so a lot of youth show up in this book. Wyatt was a foster child, that I hope broke through the stereotype of the way foster children are often represented as withdrawn, shy, angry, criminal, defiant, abusive, all these right, tropes that the people will often use in media or art to represent foster children, when there are many out there that are just really funny and artistic, creative, intelligent. I wanted Wyatt in this, to break through that trope of the angry, withdrawn foster child, and be like some of the foster kids that I worked with, that were really, really funny, and despite all their struggles and everything that they'd been through, right? I was just amazed at their resilience and their strength in dealing with that, right? With all those things, and their humor, sense of humor. So Wyatt in this book, is walks into the novel like a little guy out of the 1930s or 1940s, and so he immediately connects with Ernest, Maria's husband, who's like, oh, wow, you like jazz music? Oh, yeah, I like Sinatra, you know, and they have this conversation about, he feels like this thing that came out of history in the past and walked in wearing saddle shoes and saying, which is sort of the way I presented their son as well. And so that it informs a lot of my work, Christine, because I worked with a lot of youth, and in my last book, Where the Dead Sit Talking, I had 3 different personalities based on youth that I'd worked with. So I get a lot of my kids' my characters' personality from my social work. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Thank you, Christine. And we have another question from Kiros regarding the long walk and lack of education around it. And he clarifies too, the long walk, but all Native history and the possibilities of relocation on different territories. As the surge of land acknowledgements have come about, what are your feelings about relocated tribes and the lack of knowledge? Again, not just of the long walk, but all Native history and relocation. And he adds that he loved your book, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you could probably, I think you could probably answer this question better than I can. I mean, what my feelings are, in terms of different tribes being relocated. I just think that, and all Native history, I think it needs to be studied more, and schools and children and teachers need to be talking more about it, and especially among middle schools and high schools, so that you get young adults coming into college and having no idea about the importance of tribal history and Native. And we have over 500 tribes in the United States. I don't know what the number is exactly, but and many tribes in First Nations Canada that all have their different stories. There's so many tribes out there, and I work with these students in Santa Fe, and I'm just always amazed at their stories and how wonderful their stories are, and how different these, you know, we're in one sense we're all Native, but each tribe has their own stories, and they're all so fascinating, and we just need to, I just think we need to be better about educating people on them. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I want to second that sentiment and thank all who wrote in. We have additional comments and questions coming in, thanking you for your work and for joining us here this evening. We are out of time, but I also want to thank you, Brandon, for joining us and for this really enlightening conversation we've had tonight. And again, I'm going to encourage everyone to read not only The Removed, but all of your works. And yes, we can definitely take a photo.
If that's okay. Yeah, I was
sure thing. I can do a screenshot and send it to you.
Oh, that would probably be better. That way I'm not holding up the...
Sure thing. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rule and Dr. Hobson, for joining us. And thank you to Richard for being our ASL champion tonight. We are really grateful to everyone for tuning in for this very special event as part of both Maryland Libraries Together and also Guide to Indigenous Maryland. Please watch this space. We have some other amazing programming coming up, as well as the impending launch of the beta version of Guide to Indigenous Maryland, which is really awesome. We've been working with a statewide task force with representatives of public libraries, cultural organizations, archaeological organizations, as well as several of our tribal elders from the community here throughout Maryland. So there's a lot of important work going on also at the Maryland State Archive around making more of our primary source material about Indigenous communities here in Maryland available. So there are two events I want to draw your attention to before we go away. Also, before I do that, I want to give a shout out to the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights for co-presenting tonight's event. They're a wonderful partner locally. Also want to shout out this entire team at Maryland State Library for making this event and series possible. And we have two more events coming up this spring as part of this series. The first is Wednesday, April 27th. We'll be hosting Dr. Eric Kleinenberg from New York University. We'll be discussing his book, Palaces for the People. He puts forward a really important and compelling case for how public libraries and other organizations create what's called social infrastructure. And if we think about the pandemic, think about the things that your local public library has been doing to make sure that community members get access to internet, get access to COVID vaccines, get access to COVID testing, as well as all of the wonderful materials that enrich our lives and help us learn how to be better neighbors for each other. Additionally, on Monday, June 20th, Dr. Rule will be back for a really important panel discussion called Examining and Interpreting Native and Indigenous Heritage. She will be joined by Dr. Kyle Mays, who is an assistant professor at UCLA and author of An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Dr. Ashley Minner of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, who is also an artist and assistant curator for history and culture at Smithsonian. Rico Newman, who is a member of the Elders Council of the Chapico Band of Piscataway Indians and a member of the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, as well as Norris Howard Jr., who is a leader of the Pocomoke Nation here in Maryland. So more information about those events is available at pgcmls.info. You can also just Google Maryland Libraries Together and you'll find all the information. Support Dr. Hobson by buying his book, buying it for a friend, asking your library to purchase it in print, ebook, and audiobook. And you can certainly check them out from your local library. And seriously, if your library doesn't own his books, you need to tell them that they need to get it because his work is really important, and we appreciate him. So thank you again to everyone. Please stay safe. If there's anything that we can do to support you, please let us know. Your libraries are here for you, and we are your neighbors. So let us hook you up with whatever you need.
Thank you, Nick, and Dr. Rule. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.